In today's video, you'll dive into an emotional and mystery-filled story. The journey of Hannah, a young orphan who uncovers a surprising connection to her past. At 18, Hannah leaves the orphanage where she grew up with no clues about her family. Little does she know that her first job as a caregiver in an old mansion will lead her to long-buried secrets. As she cares for Mr. Wilkes, a man devastated by the loss of his daughter and granddaughter, Hannah begins to uncover deep and unsettling ties with this family. But how can a simple blue ribbon change everything she thought she knew about herself? As she gets closer to the truth, she faces revelations that connect her directly to a family tragedy involving secrets, regrets, and an unexpected link to her own bloodline. And when the truth about the disappearance of Charlotte, Mr. Wilkes' granddaughter, is finally revealed, how will Hannah cope with the consequences? In this video, you'll follow Hannah's desperate search for her origins to the very end and witness how her family's fate will be sealed. But what happens when the past and present collide? Discover the shocking truth that binds these characters in ways you never imagined. The morning was cold and shrouded in a soft mist when Hannah Clayton, now 18 years old, took her last step out of the orphanage that had been her home for as long as she could remember. The old red brick building seemed more imposing than ever, and with each step she took, the distance between her and what she knew as home seemed to amplify the uncertainty in her heart. With a small suitcase in one hand and a blue hair ribbon in the other, Hannah felt a mix of excitement and fear. That ribbon was all she had of her unknown past, a symbol of a bond she had never been able to identify. Mr. Donovan Reed, the director of the orphanage, stood beside her, watching her with a mixture of pride and concern. He had always had a special affection for Hannah, the girl who, despite all the adversities, always maintained a glimmer of hope in her eyes.
"Remember, Hannah,"
he began, his hoarse voice betraying the emotion he tried to hide.
"no matter what happens, never lose hope of finding your true family. Your place in the world is out there, waiting for you."
Hannah turned to him, feeling a lump in her throat. He had always treated her like a daughter, and the thought of leaving him behind was almost unbearable. But she knew she needed to move forward to find her own path.
"I will never forget, Mr. Reed,"
she replied, her voice choked.
"Thank you for everything, for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself."
They embraced, a gesture that sealed years of affection and care. When they finally parted, Hannah wiped away a stubborn tear that had rolled down her face. She turned and began to walk down the road, not looking back, determined to face whatever the future held for her. After leaving the orphanage, Hannah spent weeks searching for a job. With few skills and no experience, her search was difficult and frustrating. She moved to a small neighboring town where she began working temporary jobs, saving every penny to get by. One day, while working at a local cafe, she overheard a conversation between two customers about an open position for a caregiver at a large mansion on the outskirts of town. The ad said the position required someone patient and dedicated to care for a bedridden elderly man. Hannah, who had always been known for her caring and empathetic nature, felt that this might be her opportunity. With her heart full of hope, she went to the address listed in the ad and introduced herself at the Wilkes mansion. Upon entering, she was greeted by Mrs. Irene Morgan, the mansion's housekeeper. A tall woman with stern features and calculating eyes, she sized Hannah up before speaking.
"You must be Hannah."
Mrs. Morgan said with a slight nod.
"I hope you understand the importance of the job you are about to take on. Mr. Wilkes requires care and attention. We do not tolerate mistakes here."
Hannah, intimidated, simply nodded. She knew her life depended on this job and she would do anything to fulfill her responsibilities.
"Yes, ma'am. I'm ready for whatever is necessary,"
she replied, her voice firm despite the tension she felt. Mrs. Morgan led her through the dark, cold hallways of the mansion, which seemed to whisper stories of a long-forgotten past. The walls were adorned with family portraits, all covered in a fine layer of dust, as if time had stopped there. Along the way, they crossed paths with Mr. Caleb Hargrove, the butler. Unlike Mrs. Morgan, he greeted her with a gentle smile and a look that conveyed a certain understanding.
"Welcome, Hannah. If you need anything, I'll be around,"
he said, his calm voice offering a rare moment of comfort in that place. Hannah thanked him and followed Mrs. Morgan, feeling a little more at ease but still aware that she was about to face something unknown. Mr. Wilkes's room was located at the end of a long hallway, far from any other area of the mansion. The air there felt denser, as if it carried the weight of the years that had passed since that place had seen any joy. When the door was opened, Hannah saw an elderly man, frail-looking with deeply saddened eyes, lying in a large, antiquated bed. Mr. William Wilkes barely lifted his gaze when Hannah entered. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, trapped in a spiral of pain and regret that time could not heal. The first thing Hannah noticed was his hands, thin and trembling, resting on the sheet. There was a vulnerability there that moved her instantly. She approached slowly, not wanting to disturb him, but also wishing to offer some form of comfort. Next to the bed, a chair was positioned for her to sit and be by his side. Hannah hesitated, but then gently took his hand in hers. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. To her surprise, Mr. Wilkes squeezed her hand lightly in response, his cloudy eyes finally turning to her. There were no words, but in that brief moment, something passed between them, a connection that Hannah couldn't explain. It was as if he recognized her, as if that hand he was now holding belonged to someone he had known and lost. She didn't know exactly what he felt, but one thing was clear. Hannah felt a deep compassion for that man, a desire to help him carry the invisible burden that seemed to suffocate him. And in that instant, she made a silent promise to herself. She would care for Mr. Wilkes with all the dedication she could muster. Hannah's first night in the Wilkes mansion was marked by a mix of emotions she couldn't fully describe. Lying in bed, in a room that, although comfortable, still felt strange to her, her mind was restless with thoughts about what the future held. Hannah gazed at the ceiling as the soft moonlight streamed through the gaps in the curtains. The silence of the house was interrupted only by the gentle sound of the leaves from the trees outside, swaying in the wind. Instead of finding sleep, she found herself reflecting on the path that had brought her here. She remembered the orphanage, Mr. Reed's kindness, the moment she left that place which had, for so long, been her only home. Questions began to form in her mind. Would she be able to find her place in that mansion? Would she be able to connect with Mr. Wilkes, the elderly and frail man who seemed to carry such deep sadness? And what about her own past, the one she barely knew? She wasn't afraid, but she felt small in the face of the vastness of her new life. A sense of longing for what she had never had, a family, a story, tightened in her chest. Hannah wondered if that place, with all its secrets and stories, could truly be her home. Turning in bed, she held the blue ribbon she had always kept with her, feeling the soft fabric between her fingers. It was a small object, but it carried symbolic weight. As her eyes began to close, Hannah made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover everything she could about her past, and more than that, she would build a future she could be proud of. With that resolution, she finally allowed herself to relax, her body surrendering to the fatigue of the day. And as she fell asleep, a gentle hope began to form in her heart, a hope that perhaps finally she could find her place in the world. The next afternoon, while tidying the hallways, Hannah decided to explore a little more of the mansion. There was something intriguing about the place. Each corner seemed to tell its own story, waiting to be discovered. As she passed by an old door that was slightly ajar, she found herself standing in a room that made her stop instantly. It was the library. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of old paper and aged wood. The shelves were tall, reaching the ceiling, filled with books that appeared to have not been touched in decades. There was something solemn and almost sacred about that space, as if it were a sanctuary of the Wilkes family's past. Hannah walked slowly, allowing her fingers to glide over the dusty surface of the furniture covered with white sheets. Her gaze landed on a central table where a single book lay open, as if someone had just left it there. The exposed page showed a black and white photograph that immediately captured her attention. It was an image of a baby girl about 2 years old, sitting in a chair, wearing a simple dress and, to Hannah's astonishment, a blue hair ribbon identical to the one she always wore. The resemblance between the two ribbons was undeniable, and it made her heart race.
Who could this girl be?
Hannah wondered, feeling a growing unease within her. The possibility that the photo might have some connection to her own story deeply troubled her. She carefully closed the book, but the image of the baby continued to dance in her mind. Later that same day, Hannah found Mrs. Morgan in the kitchen busy with household chores. The housekeeper was as she always was, efficient, reserved, but with a strong presence that filled the room.
Mrs. Morgan, may I ask you something?
Hannah began hesitantly. The housekeeper looked up from her task and regarded her with a neutral expression.
Yes, of course. What do you wish to know?
She replied, her voice as always firm and emotionless.
I was in the library earlier and found a book with a photo of a baby girl. She was wearing a blue hair ribbon, very similar to the one I wear. Do you know anything about her?
For a moment, Mrs. Morgan was silent, her eyes fixed on Hannah's. It was a brief pause, but full of meaning before the housekeeper returned to her work.
Certain things from the past are better left where they are,
She finally said.
This mansion has many secrets, and not all of them need to be unearthed.
Mrs. Morgan's evasive response only served to heighten Hannah's curiosity. There was something about that photo, something in the way Mrs. Morgan reacted, that made her believe she was on the right path to uncovering more about her own past. Mrs. Morgan's tone indicated that this was not a subject to be discussed, but for Hannah, that brief exchange of words was enough to sow doubts and an even stronger desire to know the truth. Hannah thanked her and left the kitchen, but the image of the baby girl with the blue ribbon remained etched in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that somehow her life and the history of that mansion were connected by an invisible thread, waiting to be revealed. As the days passed, Hannah began to notice small changes in Mr. Wilkes's behavior. Although he still spoke little, there was a growing softness in his gaze, an acceptance of her presence that hadn't existed before. The silence between them, which initially felt uncomfortable, now seemed to be a kind of communication in itself, an invisible bridge built on shared pain. Every day, Hannah read to him. She chose books from the library, those that seemed old and cherished, whose worn pages told stories of times gone by. Mr. Wilkes listened in silence, but there were moments when he let slip a small expression, a fleeting smile, a solitary tear, that made clear the impact of the words. On one particularly quiet afternoon, while reading a passage from a novel about family and loss, Mr. Wilkes broke the silence.
Charlotte.
He whispered almost inaudibly. Hannah stopped reading, surprised. It was the first time he had mentioned a name since she began caring for him. She waited, but Mr. Wilkes soon withdrew again, as if he had said something he shouldn't have. His eyes lost their momentary sparkle, and he looked away, sinking back into his own sorrow. The name Charlotte echoed in Hannah's mind. Who could this person be? She knew she shouldn't press him, but the weight of that word, spoken with such emotion, made her realize that Mr. Wilkes carried an immense burden, something that went beyond his frail health. There was a deep sadness there, and Hannah felt an increasing desire to help, to alleviate some of the suffering he seemed to guard so desperately. It was a spring afternoon, and the sun cast its gentle rays through the mansion's corridors, illuminating the antique furniture and bringing a rare warmth to the atmosphere. Hannah was in the kitchen, busy with routine tasks, when Mr. Caleb Hargrove entered, his usually calm demeanor appearing darker than usual.
Hannah, may I speak with you for a moment?
He asked, his voice laden with a seriousness that put her on alert. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron and approaching the table where he was sitting. Hargrove hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing the words he would say next.
You must have noticed that Mr. Wilkes carries a great weight, something that goes beyond his illness.
he began, his voice low, almost like a whisper.
The truth is that this house, this family has been destroyed by a secret that haunts us all.
Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. Hargrove's words were like pieces of a puzzle that were beginning to fit together with what she had already perceived.
What happened?
She asked, almost fearing the answer. Hargrove looked at her, his eyes reflecting years of contained sadness.
There was a loss, a terrible loss that Mr. Wilkes has never been able to overcome. Charlotte.
He paused, letting the name hang in the air like a ghost finally materializing. Charlotte was his granddaughter, the daughter of Elizabeth, who, in turn, was the light of Mr. Wilkes's life. Elizabeth lost her daughter, Charlotte, under circumstances that still torment us to this day. She never recovered and passed away months later, consumed by grief and guilt. Hannah felt her heart tighten upon hearing this. The name Charlotte now had a face imagined in her mind, a missing child whose absence still weighed so heavily.
And Charlotte's father?
Hannah asked, sensing there was more to this story. Hargrove sighed deeply before responding.
Charlotte's father, James, was a devoted and loving man. When Charlotte disappeared, he was devastated. But unlike Elizabeth, he dedicated himself entirely to searching for his daughter, refusing to accept that she could be lost forever. This led to such a physical and emotional strain that he ultimately succumbed to a sudden illness just a few months after Elizabeth's death. Mr. Wilkes lost not only his daughter and granddaughter, but also the son-in-law he considered a son. Since then, this mansion has become a place of mourning.
Hannah fell silent, absorbing the weight of the story. The loss of Charlotte had devastated the Wilkes family, leading not only to the death of her mother, Elizabeth, but also that of her father, James. Now more than ever, Hannah felt the responsibility to uncover the truth about what happened to Charlotte and to bring some kind of peace to Mr. Wilkes, the last remnant of that shattered family.
I can't tell you all the details as I don't know everything myself,
Hargrove continued, his tone darker.
but I ask that you continue caring for Mr. Wilkes. He needs more than physical care. He needs redemption, a forgiveness that may never come. And perhaps, just perhaps, you can help bring a little peace to this house.
Hannah nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility now resting on her shoulders. Mr. Wilkes's pain was tied to the loss of his daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter, and somehow, Hannah knew she was destined to discover more, to understand what truly happened in that mansion. Sunday arrived, bringing with it a cloudy sky, with clouds slowly moving over the town. It was her day off, and Hannah felt an inexplicable need to leave the mansion, to breathe the fresh air and clear her thoughts. She decided to walk to the local cemetery, a place she had only glimpsed when she arrived in town. The cemetery was on a gentle hill, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to guard the secrets of those resting there. The gravestones, some worn by time, were arranged in neat rows, and Hannah walked among them with silent reverence. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but something compelled her to continue. Finally, her eyes were drawn to a gravestone that stood out from the others. It was older, and the words engraved on it were slightly faded, but still legible. Charlotte Wilkes, 1993 to 1995. Beloved forever. The name Charlotte hit her like a blow. She stood still for a moment, her heart racing. The dates of birth and death coincided with the time when she herself had been left at the orphanage. Beside the gravestone, a small doll was carefully placed, and around the doll's neck was a blue ribbon, almost identical to the one Hannah had always kept. The sight of the ribbon disturbed her, and a feeling of loss and sadness filled her heart. Hannah knelt down and picked up the doll, feeling the weight of the inexplicable connection she seemed to have with that child. The tragic story of Elizabeth Wilkes flashed through Hannah's mind. She imagined the pain of losing such a young daughter, and then the agony of living without answers, not knowing what had truly happened. The pain was so great that it ultimately consumed Elizabeth, taking away her will to live. Mr. Wilkes lost not only his granddaughter, but also the daughter he loved so dearly.
Who was Charlotte to Mr. Wilkes?
She wondered. And more importantly, how was that story connected to her own? As she stood there by the grave, Hannah felt that the answers were drawing ever closer, but she also feared what she might discover. With a tightness in her heart, she placed the doll back in its place, letting the blue ribbon flutter gently in the wind. Hargrove's words echoed in her mind, and Hannah knew she needed to continue investigating. Something was pulling her into that story, something that seemed to be beyond her own understanding. The night fell heavily over the Wilkes mansion, bringing with it a constant rain that tapped against the windows with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The sound of the drops seemed to amplify the silence within the house, creating an atmosphere of introspection. Hannah was sitting beside Mr. Wilkes's bed, watching him sleep. In recent days, he seemed more fragile than ever, his physical health deteriorating rapidly. Suddenly, he began to stir restlessly, murmuring disconnected words in his sleep. Hannah leaned in closer, trying to understand what he was saying.
Charlotte, forgive me.
The words escaped his lips with a tone of desperation. He gripped Hannah's hand tightly, his eyes still closed, but his face contorted in agony.
I failed you, my little one. It was all my fault.
He continued, as tears began to trickle down his wrinkled face. He didn't seem to realize he was speaking to Hannah, but rather to a ghost from the past that haunted him. Hannah felt a tightness in her chest. His words struck her like lightning, bringing forth a disconcerting sense of déjà vu. It was as if, somehow, she was reliving something she already knew, something buried deep within her mind.
Please forgive me, Charlotte. I should have been stronger.
Mr. Wilkes kept murmuring as the tears flowed uncontrollably. Hannah, unable to contain her own emotion, held his hand tighter, trying to convey some form of comfort. But his words echoed in her mind, awakening hazy memories she couldn't quite grasp. There was something there, something that connected her to the pain Mr. Wilkes felt, but she couldn't fully understand what it was. With a heavy heart, she realized that Mr. Wilkes was being consumed by unbearable guilt, and that perhaps the only path to peace lay in uncovering the truth about what really happened to Charlotte. The next day, while tidying up Mr. Wilkes's room, Hannah noticed a small drawer in the bedside table that seemed stuck. After a moment of effort, she managed to open it and found an old diary at the bottom, its pages worn by time. Curiosity overtook her, and she sat down beside the bed, carefully opening the diary. The delicate handwriting on the yellowed pages belonged to Elizabeth Wilkes, the late daughter of Mr. Wilkes and mother of Charlotte. The diary was a window into the happy days she spent with her newborn daughter. The words were imbued with love and hope, describing little Charlotte as the light of their lives. Hannah read with a tight heart, feeling the joy and affection that emanated from Elizabeth's words. But as she progressed through the pages, the tone of the diary began to shift. Elizabeth started to mention a growing discomfort, a feeling that something was wrong.
There's a man who frightens me.
Elizabeth wrote in one of the last entries.
He works here in the mansion, but there's something in his eyes, something that sends a chill down my spine whenever he's around. I don't know what to do. I don't want to seem paranoid, but I'm afraid for Charlotte.
Hannah felt a shiver run down her spine as she read those words. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push away a memory that began to surface. A man with a threatening gaze, watching her from a distance. The image was vague, but enough to leave her disturbed. Elizabeth continued to express her growing fear of the man, whom she referred to as the stranger, but there weren't enough details to identify who he was. The last entry in the diary was written just days before Charlotte's disappearance, and the tone was one of pure despair, as if Elizabeth knew something terrible was about to happen. Hannah closed the diary with trembling hands, her heart racing. Elizabeth's fear now seemed to echo in her own chest, and the connection between her past and the mystery surrounding Charlotte was becoming stronger and more frightening. That afternoon, with Elizabeth's diary still echoing in her mind, Hannah searched for Mr. Hargrove. She knew he was the only one who could help her unravel the mystery. When she found him in the garden, working quietly as always, she felt a growing urgency to get answers.
Mr. Hargrove, I need to talk to you.
Hannah said, her voice laden with tension. He turned to her, immediately sensing that something was wrong.
What's happened, Hannah?
He asked, abandoning what he was doing. Hannah took the diary from her pocket and showed it to him.
I found this in Mr. Wilkes' room. It's Elizabeth's diary. She mentions a man, someone she feared. Who was he? And what does he have to do with Charlotte's disappearance?
Mr. Hargrove fell silent for a moment, the weight of the truth finally catching up to him. He sighed deeply, knowing he could no longer hide what he knew.
That man was Peter Novak, one of the gardeners for the family at the time.
He began, his voice low.
He was a long-time employee, someone we trusted, but there was something about him that always worried me, a darkness he hid well.
Hannah felt her heart race. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place.
Peter was a reserved man, but a hard worker. However, shortly after Charlotte's disappearance, he began to behave strangely. He was always nervous, avoided eye contact, and then, a few months later, he was fired. Mr. Wilkes couldn't bear the presence of anyone who reminded him of that day, so Peter left, and no one ever heard from him again.
Hannah remained silent, absorbing this new information. The idea that Peter Novak could be linked to Charlotte's disappearance was disturbing, but it made sense. She vaguely remembered a man watching her from afar, and the image began to solidify.
Do you think that he could be involved?
Hannah asked, her voice faltering. Mr. Hargrove looked at her with infinite sadness.
I can't say for certain, but it's possible. Something happened to Charlotte, something terrible, and Peter was here at the time. Unfortunately, back then, we were all so devastated that we didn't notice the clues that were right in front of us. But I can't state anything beyond that.
Hargrove's words hit her hard, and the weight of the truth began to reveal itself. Hannah felt a whirlwind of emotions: fear, sadness, anger. The mystery surrounding her past was starting to clarify, but the open wounds from these revelations were far from healing. With a heavy heart, she knew she would need to investigate further to discover what really happened to Charlotte and if Peter Novak was indeed involved. The truth was beginning to emerge, but the path to fully understanding it would be long and painful for everyone. Hannah knew she could no longer hide her discoveries. The weight of what she had learned about Mr. Wilkes's past and her own history was becoming unbearable. She decided it was time to confront him, to reveal what she had found, and perhaps to begin healing the open wounds. On a quiet afternoon, she entered Mr. Wilkes's room with the blue ribbon and Elizabeth's diary in hand. He was sitting on the bed, looking out the window with a vacant expression, lost in thought. Hannah approached slowly and sat down beside him.
Mr. Wilkes.
She began, her voice soft but firm.
I need to show you something.
He turned slowly, his cloudy eyes fixing on her. Hannah extended the blue ribbon and the diary. At first he just stared, confused, but when he saw the ribbon, something changed in his expression. He took it with trembling hands, and an overwhelming emotion washed over his face.
Where did you get this?
He asked, his voice breaking with emotion.
I've had it for as long as I can remember. I always thought it was the only thing left of my past, but there's more, much more.
She handed him the diary, opening it to the page where Elizabeth mentioned her fear for Charlotte. Mr. Wilkes began to read, and soon tears began to stream down his face. He sobbed, holding the ribbon with one hand and the diary with the other, as if trying to cling to a piece of his lost granddaughter.
Charlotte, my Charlotte.
He murmured, his voice filled with pain.
I lost so much time.
Hannah could no longer hold back her own tears. Seeing Mr. Wilkes's pain so exposed, the devastation of a grandfather who had lost everything hit her deeply.
I am Charlotte, aren't I?
She asked, her voice weak, seeking confirmation. He looked at her, the tears now mixed with a kind of recognition. His eyes for the first time seemed to see through all the lost time, the pain, and the regret.
I don't know, but I do know one thing. You look so much like Elizabeth, my Elizabeth. I think you are my granddaughter.
He whispered before breaking down into deep sobs, holding Hannah as if he never wanted to let her go. The reunion was painfully devastating for both. Mr. Wilkes felt the weight of years of suffering, of a life spent in despair and loneliness, realizing how much he had lost. Hannah, in turn, was overwhelmed with immense sadness for the time that could never be reclaimed, for the memories she never had. And there, amidst the tears, grandfather and granddaughter found each other, united by pain, but also by the hope of a different future. Later that same day, Hannah met with Mrs. Morgan in the kitchen. The housekeeper, who had always treated her with coldness and suspicion, watched her enter with an expression that mixed suspicion and irritation.
I need to talk to you, Mrs. Morgan.
Hannah began, trying to remain calm. Mrs. Morgan crossed her arms, her hard gaze fixed on Hannah.
What do you want?
She asked, already in a defensive tone.
I think I know who I am. I found Elizabeth's diary, and Mr. Wilkes recognized the blue ribbon. I am Charlotte, his granddaughter.
For a moment, Mrs. Morgan was silent, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to understand what Hannah was saying. Then, an expression of disbelief took over her face.
That's impossible!
She exclaimed, her voice raised.
You cannot be Charlotte! You must be trying to take advantage of a sick old man and his pain.
Hannah felt the accusation like a slap, but she maintained her composure.
I just want to know the truth.
She replied, trying to control the emotion in her voice.
I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from, who I was. I'm not trying to take advantage of anyone. I just want to understand what happened.
Mrs. Morgan looked at her with a mix of anger and frustration. The idea that the girl she despised could be Mr. Wilkes's lost granddaughter seemed absurd to her.
I don't know what you're trying to do, but this isn't going to end well for you. Stay away from Mr. Wilkes before you cause him more pain.
Mrs. Morgan said, her voice full of bitterness. Hannah felt the fury and distrust in those words, but she also sensed that there was something more there, something that Mrs. Morgan was trying to hide or deny. Still, Hannah knew she could not stop now. She had to move forward, find the truth, even if it meant facing the hostility of everyone around her. After the confrontation with Mrs. Morgan, Mr. Wilkes decided that the only way to confirm Hannah's identity would be through a DNA test. Despite the whirlwind of emotions, he knew he needed concrete proof, something that would confirm what his heart already believed. The test was conducted, and the days that followed were agonizing for both. Hannah, even though she already felt the connection between her and Mr. Wilkes was real, could not shake the fear of what the result might reveal. For Mr. Wilkes, the wait was even more torturous. He had allowed himself to believe that his granddaughter was back, but he knew that if the test came back negative, he wouldn't survive another loss. Finally, the day arrived. The result was positive. Hannah was indeed Charlotte Wilkes. When they received the confirmation, Mr. Wilkes broke down in tears again, but this time there was a mix of joy and pain. He looked at Hannah, now absolutely certain that he was in front of his granddaughter.
Forgive me, Charlotte. Forgive me for not being able to protect you. I failed you. I failed Elizabeth, and I failed myself.
He held Hannah's hands tightly, his voice laden with guilt and sorrow. Hannah, despite the joy of finally finding her grandfather, felt a heavy weight in her heart. His words reflected years of suffering, of regret for all that he had lost.
I don't blame you, grandfather,
she replied, her eyes misty.
We were both deprived of so much, but I'm here now. And maybe we can start to rebuild what we lost.
Mr. Wilkes looked at her with an expression of deep love and gratitude. He knew he could not change the past, but Charlotte's presence now gave him a new hope, a chance to finally find some peace.
I promise I will do everything I can to make up for the lost time, my granddaughter.
His voice was firm, but his eyes still reflected the pain of what had been stolen from them. Hannah nodded, but even with the confirmation of her identity, She could not help but feel sadness for the memories that could never be reclaimed. Still, in that moment, they were together, and that was all that mattered. They embraced again, both aware that the path to healing would be long and difficult, but willing to walk that journey together as grandfather and granddaughter. The morning sun had just begun to rise when Hannah and Mr. Wilkes arrived at the orphanage that had been Hannah's home for so many years. The facade of the building was familiar to Hannah, but this time, alongside her biological grandfather, she saw it in a new light. The place where she had grown up, filled with memories of her childhood, now seemed small and distant compared to the weight of the truth she carried. Mrs. Ellen Carter, one of the longest-serving staff members, greeted them with a warm, albeit slightly perplexed, smile. She remembered Hannah, the quiet girl who always carried a blue ribbon.
"It's good to see you again, Hannah,"
said Mrs. Carter, giving her a brief hug.
"And this is—"
My grandfather.
Hannah replied with a mix of pride and uncertainty. Mr. Wilkes nodded respectfully. They were led to the main office, where old records and documents were still kept. As Mrs. Carter rummaged through aging papers, she began to recall the day Hannah had arrived at the orphanage.
"I remember that day as if it were yesterday."
She began, her voice soft with heavy nostalgia.
"A man brought you here. He said he found you alone in a park. He seemed nervous, but at the time, we thought it was just the shock of finding a lost child."
Hannah felt a shiver run down her spine. She and Mr. Wilkes exchanged a meaningful glance.
What was this man like?
Mr. Wilkes asked, his voice tense.
"He was strange in a way, nervous as if he was hiding something. But to us, he seemed like a good Samaritan. We never investigated further. It was a difficult time, and lost children were common."
Mrs. Carter leaned in closer, as if revealing a secret.
"We never knew what happened to you before that day, Hannah. But that man, he seemed to carry a burden. I never saw him again."
With this new information, Hannah and Mr. Wilkes felt they were closer to the truth. The description of the man was vague, but the idea that he had brought Hannah to the orphanage suggested something much darker in her past. Back at the mansion, the conversation with Mrs. Carter still lingered in Hannah's mind. She and Mr. Wilkes headed to the library, where the family photo albums were kept, covered in a fine layer of dust. Sitting side by side, they began to flip through the pages, passing through years of memories frozen in photographs. As they turned page after page, Hannah noticed a photograph of the mansion's staff, taken shortly before her disappearance. She recognized some of the faces, but one in particular caught her attention. It was the gardener, Peter Novak. She looked at the photo more closely, and her mind began to connect the dots. The image of the man in the photograph fit the vague description given by Mrs. Carter.
Grandfather, look.
She said, showing the photo to Mr. Wilkes.
This is the man Mrs. Carter described, Peter Novak. He was here at the time, and he is the man who brought me to the orphanage.
Mr. Wilkes took the photo in his hands, his face contorting with pain and anger as he recognized Peter.
Peter was a quiet man. No one ever suspected him. But now it makes sense. The strange behavior, the nervousness.
Hannah began to realize the gravity of the situation. The resemblance between the behavior described by Mrs. Carter and the man in the photograph was undeniable.
Peter may have been more than just an employee,
Hannah said, her voice trembling slightly.
I think he was involved in some way in my disappearance.
Mr. Wilkes nodded, absorbing the revelation with a palpable weight in the air. They had to find out more about Peter, and the next step would be to locate him. After some searching, Hannah and Mr. Wilkes discovered that Peter Novak was living in a nursing home in a nearby town. The news caught them by surprise. No one in the mansion had imagined that Peter, an apparently loyal and discreet employee, could be involved in something so sinister. Now, with the new information, they knew they needed to confront him. The nursing home was a modest building with a simple facade and well-kept gardens. Upon entering, they were greeted by a nurse who led them down the quiet halls to Peter's room.
He rarely speaks and lives in a state of mental confusion,
The nurse explained.
He is one of our most tranquil patients, but also one of the most distant. He rarely responds to visits.
When they entered the room, Hannah felt a mix of emotions: anger, fear, compassion. Peter was sitting in a wheelchair, looking out the window, seemingly oblivious to their presence. But upon seeing Hannah, something changed. His once empty eyes sparkled for a moment, and he began to murmur.
The girl I should have never taken.
He murmured, the words coming out with difficulty. Mr. Wilkes stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion.
Peter, what did you do?
He asked, trying to contain his despair. Peter looked at them, his eyes filled with deep sadness.
I was desperate. My daughter was dying, and no one helped me.
He began, his voice heavy with pain.
I asked you for help, but you had your own problems. When she died, something in me broke. I wanted you to feel the pain I felt, so I took Charlotte. I wanted you to know what it is to lose someone.
Hannah felt her heart tighten upon hearing those words. What had once seemed like a matter of pure malice now revealed itself as a desperate act from a broken man.
But I couldn't harm her.
Peter continued, tears streaming down his face.
When I looked at her, so innocent, I realized what I had done. I took her to the park, and then to the orphanage. I couldn't anymore, but it was too late. I took her from her family, and my guilt consumed me.
Hannah listened in silence, feeling a mix of anger, compassion, and sadness. Peter's words revealed a cycle of pain and despair that began long before she was born. Mr. Wilkes fell to his knees beside Peter's chair, tears streaming down his face.
I failed too, Peter. I failed you. I failed my family. I never knew. I never knew you needed help.
He held the hand of the old gardener, who was now lost in his own pain. Hannah, with a heavy heart, realized that while she could not change the past, she now had the chance to break this cycle of pain. They left the nursing home in silence, aware that while the answers were painful, they were necessary to move forward. The days following the revelation at the asylum were filled with conflicting emotions for Hannah and Mr. Wilkes. He was determined to rebuild the relationship with his lost granddaughter and perhaps find some redemption by trying to make up for lost time. With this idea in mind, Mr. Wilkes invited Hannah to live with him in the mansion permanently.
I want this to be your home, Charlotte,
he said, using the name she hadn't heard since childhood.
We can start anew, bring joy to this place that has long been a symbol of pain.
Hannah, though touched by her grandfather's gesture and intentions, felt a pang of discomfort. The mansion, with all its grandeur and history, still felt strange to her, a constant reminder of a life she never had the chance to live. Mr. Wilkes was determined to transform the mansion into a vibrant and welcoming place again. He hired gardeners to revitalize the gardens, painters to renew the faded walls, and decorators to bring new colors and life into the house. Each change was made with the intention of erasing the shadows of the past and creating a home that could be a new foundation for Hannah and him.
I want you to feel that this is your home, Charlotte,
he said, showing her the plans for the renovated garden where colorful flowers would replace the long withering plants.
A place where we can finally be happy.
Hannah smiled, grateful for her grandfather's effort, but inside she felt restless. The grandeur of the mansion and the implicit expectations made her uncomfortable. She had never imagined living in that world of luxury, and adapting seemed more difficult than she had anticipated. As the days passed, Hannah began to feel the weight of her new identity as Charlotte Wilkes. The pressure to adjust to the life of an heiress, surrounded by luxury and social responsibilities, was overwhelming. She felt out of place in a world she didn't recognize as her own. The simplicity she had grown up with in the orphanage seemed to belong to another universe, distant and unreachable. Mr. Wilkes' attempts to introduce her to the social circles of high society weren't helping either. Hannah was constantly introduced to people who expected her to fit perfectly into that world, as if the lost years had left no scars. The expectation that she would take an active role in society, attending events and representing the Wilkes family, only heightened her sense of inadequacy.
You have to learn to be strong, Charlotte.
Mr. Wilkes insisted, unaware of how much his words pressured her.
We have a responsibility to our family name.
But Hannah didn't see herself as the perfect granddaughter he expected her to be. She was struggling to reconcile her identity as Hannah Clayton, the orphan who had fought to find her place in the world, with Charlotte Wilkes, the heiress of a vast fortune and a respected name. Mrs. Morgan, in turn, was not making the situation any easier. The housekeeper continued to treat her with coldness and disdain, making it clear that, in her opinion, Hannah would never be worthy of taking Charlotte's place. Mrs. Morgan's harsh glares and cutting remarks created an invisible yet powerful barrier between Hannah and the mansion.
Don't think you can just come back and take a place that was never yours.
Mrs. Morgan said during a confrontation.
You may be his granddaughter, but you will never be like Charlotte was.
These words weighed heavily on Hannah, increasing the feeling that she was trying to fill a void that perhaps could never be filled. The mansion, with all its renewed beauty, still felt like a strange place, a house she couldn't call home. One night, after a long dinner filled with uncomfortable silences and forced smiles, Hannah felt suffocated. The pressure of being someone she didn't recognize was becoming unbearable. She looked around the mansion with all its renovations and luxury and felt a deep sense of displacement. The decision was impulsive but felt inevitable. She packed a small suitcase with some clothes and personal items and waited until everyone in the house was asleep. The hallway, usually filled with whispers of the past, now felt like a path to freedom. Hannah quietly descended the stairs, her heart racing as she passed through the decorated rooms. Each step took her further away from a world that had never been hers. When she reached the front door, she looked back for a brief moment, hesitating. But the feeling of not belonging was too strong. With one last look at the mansion, she opened the door and disappeared into the cold, dark night, leaving behind the house that had been both the beginning and the end of so many hopes. The next morning, when Mr. Wilkes discovered that Hannah had left, despair took hold of him. The thought of losing his granddaughter again, after everything they had been through, was unbearable. He felt the ground open beneath his feet as if the world were collapsing around him.
Hargrove!
He shouted, his voice laden with urgency and fear.
Find her! Bring her back! I can't lose her again!
The butler, who understood his master's pain better than anyone, immediately set out to search for Hannah. But as he searched, Mr. Wilkes knew there was a real chance that she might not want to be found, that perhaps it was too late to mend the wounds of the past. Hannah, for her part, wandered through the empty streets of the city, the cold biting at her skin. She felt lost, both physically and emotionally. But at the same time, there was a relief in distancing herself from a place she could never call home. She knew her escape would cause pain to Mr. Wilkes, but she felt she needed to find herself before she could truly connect with the grandfather she had finally found. After hours of wandering through the cold, dark streets of the city, Hannah finally found refuge in a small roadside cafe. The place was nearly empty, except for a familiar face she recognized immediately. Javier Ramirez, the young kitchen assistant from the mansion, was sitting in a corner, holding a warm cup of coffee between his hands. He looked up, and upon seeing Hannah, a look of surprise and concern spread across his face.
Hannah, what are you doing here?
He asked, quickly getting up and approaching her. Hannah couldn't respond immediately. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Feeling tears beginning to form, she looked away, trying to maintain her composure. Javier, noticing her state, led her to a table and sat down beside her.
Hey, it's okay. You can tell me what happened,
he said, his voice filled with kindness and concern. Hannah began to open up, talking about how suffocated she felt in the mansion, about the pressure of trying to adapt to a life she didn't recognize as her own. The words came out with difficulty, but Javier listened patiently, without interrupting her. He understood the weight she carried, as he himself came from a difficult life and knew what it felt like to be out of place.
Running away seems like the easiest solution, but it doesn't solve the problems.
Javier said after Hannah finished speaking.
I've tried to run away many times, but I realized that what we really need to do is face our fears. Running only distances us from the people who truly care about us.
Hannah looked at him, absorbing his words. Javier had always been a discreet yet welcoming presence in the mansion. He was one of the few who didn't judge her, who treated her with kindness without expecting anything in return.
You can stay at my place if you want.
Javier offered.
I have a spare room. It'll be a quiet place for you to think and decide what you really want to do.
Hannah accepted the offer gratefully. She felt relieved that she didn't have to go back to the mansion immediately, and at the same time, she knew she needed time and space to process everything that was happening. Javier took her to his home, a small and cozy apartment where she felt safe and welcomed. While Hannah was recovering at Javier's house, Mr. Hargrove continued the search for her. After a whole day of unsuccessful searching, he finally received a call from Javier, who wanted to reassure everyone about Hannah's whereabouts.
She's here with me, Mr. Hargrove.
Javier said on the other end of the line.
She's fine, but she needs some time to think. I thought it would be best to give her that space.
Mr. Hargrove sighed with relief. Knowing that Hannah was safe brought him a momentary peace, but he knew that Mr. Wilkes would be anxious to bring her back. Before leaving in search of Hannah, Mr. Wilkes had left a letter with Hargrove, asking him to deliver it to Hannah if he found her. Hargrove knew this was the right moment.
Javier, I have a letter from Mr. Wilkes for her. It's important that she reads it.
Hargrove said.
I trust you to deliver it when you think she's ready.
Javier nodded, although Hargrove couldn't see him, and agreed to take the letter to Hannah. When he returned home, he waited until Hannah was calmer, then handed her the sealed envelope.
Your grandfather wrote this for you,
he said gently.
I think you should read it.
Hannah looked at the letter, feeling a mix of curiosity and fear. She took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it slowly. As she read her grandfather's words, tears began to silently flow down her face. In the letter, Mr. Wilkes expressed all his love and regret, admitting to past failures and asking for a second chance to be the grandfather she deserved. He described the unbearable pain of losing her twice and begged her to come home, where they could try to build a life together.
Hannah,
he wrote,
I can't change the past, but I can promise that I will do everything in my power to build a better future for both of us. Please come home. I miss you and believe that together we can find the happiness we have been searching for.
Mr. Wilkes's words touched Hannah's heart deeply. She knew he was genuinely trying to make amends, and that, despite all the challenges, he deserved a chance. She realized that running away was not the solution. Facing her fears and building a new beginning was the right path. After spending a few days reflecting at Javier's house, Hannah finally made a decision. She knew she couldn't keep running away. Javier, with his patience and support, helped her realize that although the past was painful, there was an opportunity to build something new and meaningful alongside her grandfather.
I think I'm ready to go back,
she told Javier with a hesitant smile.
I'm sure he'll be happy to see you again,
Javier replied, glad to see her more confident. Hannah knew that the return wouldn't be easy, but she felt strengthened by the letter and the conversation she had with Javier. She packed her things, thanked Javier for everything, and he took her back to the mansion. Upon arriving, the atmosphere felt different, less oppressive than before. When Hannah entered the mansion, she was greeted with surprise and joy by Mr. Hargrove, who immediately ran to inform Mr. Wilkes. He came quickly, almost running down the hallway, his heart racing with anxiety and relief. When he saw her, he stopped for a moment, as if he needed to make sure she was really there.
Hannah, Charlotte,
he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. Without waiting for a response, he hugged her, tears streaming down his face.
I thought I had lost you again. Please forgive me.
Hannah, enveloped by the warmth of her grandfather's embrace, finally felt at home. Although she knew there would still be challenges ahead, she was ready to face them alongside him. She returned the hug, determined to accept the love he was offering and to try to build something new. The mansion, which once seemed a place of pain and suffering, was now starting to transform into a home. With her grandfather's letter and Javier's support, Hannah realized that the return to the mansion was not just a physical return, but also an emotional and spiritual one. She was ready to face whatever came her way, alongside her grandfather in search of a future filled with hope and love. The days following Hannah's return to the mansion marked the beginning of a new phase in her life and Mr. Wilkes's. Determined to rebuild their relationship, grandfather and granddaughter started spending more time together. Mr. Wilkes, once a reserved man filled with sadness, now made a point of sharing stories of the Wilkes family, both joyful and painful. During long walks through the gardens, he spoke of his own parents, the construction of the mansion, and the traditions that had been passed down through generations. He recounted how Elizabeth, Hannah's mother, had stood out since she was little, always shining in everything she did. Then he talked about how Charlotte's arrival had brought light and hope into their lives. The memories of Elizabeth and Charlotte brought tears to Mr. Wilkes's eyes, but Hannah noticed that by talking about the past, he was beginning to heal his wounds. Hannah, in turn, started to feel more connected to her grandfather. She absorbed each story, gaining a better understanding of the complexities of her family and the reasons behind so many difficult decisions. Over time, the mansion, once a place filled with shadows and painful memories, began to feel more welcoming. Hannah's presence brought a new energy to the house, gradually transforming it into a true home.
You know, grandfather,
Hannah said one day while they were sitting in the library surrounded by old photo albums.
I feel like we are starting to build something special here, something that will last.
Mr. Wilkes looked at her, his eyes shining with pride and emotion.
I'm glad you feel that way, Charlotte. I've always wanted this house to be a place of joy and love, and now, with you here, I feel like that is finally possible.
As the relationship between Hannah and Mr. Wilkes strengthened, Mrs. Morgan observed the change with a mix of surprise and admiration. The housekeeper, who had maintained a rigid and suspicious stance towards Hannah for so long, began to see the young woman differently. Hannah's determination to become part of her grandfather's life and to improve the mansion began to soften Mrs. Morgan's hardened heart. One afternoon, while Hannah was in the kitchen helping to prepare tea, Mrs. Morgan quietly entered and watched the scene for a moment before speaking.
Hannah, may I speak with you?
She asked, her voice softer than usual. Hannah looked at her with a bit of surprise, but nodded and approached.
Of course, Mrs. Morgan, what is it?
The housekeeper hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing her words.
I know that at first, I wasn't exactly welcoming to you. In fact, I was harsh and distant.
She began, her eyes fixed on the floor.
I've always been afraid that your return would bring more pain to Mr. Wilkes. I've seen him suffer so much over the years, and the thought of losing you again terrified me.
Hannah stood in silence, absorbing Mrs. Morgan's words. She felt a mix of understanding and sadness, realizing that behind the housekeeper's stern facade was a deep care for her grandfather.
I understand, Mrs. Morgan. I believe we all feared reopening old wounds.
Hannah replied, her voice gentle. Mrs. Morgan finally raised her gaze and looked into Hannah's eyes, revealing a sincerity that the young woman had never seen before.
But now, seeing how hard you have been working to be part of his life, to bring joy back to this house, I realize that you are not just the granddaughter you lost, but someone who can also bring healing.
She let out a small sigh before continuing.
I want you to know that I am willing to accept you as part of this family. And perhaps we can start anew?
Hannah felt a lump in her throat upon hearing those words. She had always wanted to be accepted, not only by her grandfather, but also by those who had been part of his life.
I would love to start anew, Mrs. Morgan. Thank you for this.
Hannah said, taking a step forward for a shy hug, which Mrs. Morgan returned with emotion. That was a moment of reconciliation that brought peace to both their hearts. Over time, Mrs. Morgan began to treat Hannah with the kindness and respect she deserved, and the two women started to build a bond that would further strengthen the Wilkes family. With harmony restored in the mansion, Hannah and Mr. Wilkes decided it was time to take another step toward the future. They agreed that a complete renovation of the mansion would not only modernize the space, but also symbolize the new beginning they were trying to build together.
I want this house to be a reflection of what we are trying to create, grandfather.
Hannah said while they discussed the renovations.
A place that is welcoming, vibrant, full of life, something we can share with others.
Mr. Wilkes smiled, proud of his granddaughter's spirit of renewal.
I agree, Charlotte. This will be our legacy, a place where we can welcome friends, family, and create new memories together.
The renovation began immediately. The rooms, once dark and heavy, were painted in bright and cheerful colors. Old furniture was replaced with comfortable and modern pieces, and the gardens were transformed into blooming and inviting spaces. The mansion, which had once seemed a mausoleum of sadness, began to shine with new energy. To mark this new phase, Mr. Wilkes and Hannah decided to throw a grand party. They invited friends, neighbors, and everyone who had been important in their lives. The celebration would be a symbol of the rebirth of the Wilkes family and an opportunity to show the world that the past had finally been left behind. On the day of the party, the mansion was stunning. The lights sparkled in the windows, soft music filled the air, and laughter echoed through the halls. Hannah, dressed in a beautiful gown, circulated among the guests alongside her grandfather, finally feeling at peace.
I think we did it, grandfather.
She said, smiling as she looked at the mansion filled with life.
This place has truly become a home.
Yes, we did.
Mr. Wilkes replied, his eyes filled with tears of joy.
And it's all thanks to you.
They embraced, knowing that although the path had been difficult, the future was now full of possibilities. The Wilkes mansion, once a place of sorrow, had become a symbol of renewal and hope, a home where the painful past had been overcome and where a new chapter was just beginning. The morning sun was gentle, casting golden rays over the hills as Mr. Wilkes and Hannah walked together toward the cemetery. The air was fresh and carried with it a feeling of renewal, fitting for the occasion that was approaching. They walked side by side, unhurried, each step marked by a silence that was not uncomfortable but respectful. Finally, they arrived at their destination, the grave of Elizabeth Wilkes and the false grave of Charlotte, created after her disappearance when everyone believed she had died. Charlotte's gravestone, cold and faded by time, was a reminder of the dark past that both were now seeking to leave behind. Hannah stopped in front of the gravestone, her fingers gently touching the name engraved there. She felt a mix of sadness and relief as she realized that the child everyone believed to be lost was, in fact, alive, standing right there in front of her own grave.
It's strange, isn't it?
She said, breaking the silence.
Seeing my own name here, but at the same time, I feel grateful, because this is a symbol of what we have overcome.
Mr. Wilkes nodded, his voice choked with emotion.
This place was where I came to mourn the loss of my granddaughter. But today, I come to celebrate the woman you've become, Hannah, or rather, Charlotte.
He smiled, trying to hold back tears. With a determined gesture, they removed the gravestone marking Charlotte's false grave. The stone, a symbol of mourning and pain, was set aside, leaving only bare earth in its place, a blank page ready for a new beginning. Then they knelt together before Elizabeth's grave, placing fresh flowers at the site. The silence that followed was filled with a deep peace, as if Elizabeth herself were there, blessing the reunion of grandfather and granddaughter.
She would have been so happy to see you, Hannah.
Mr. Wilkes murmured, tears streaming down his face.
I just wish she were here to witness this.
Hannah, touched by her grandfather's words, squeezed his hand, feeling a deep connection with the woman she never knew, but whose love was still palpable.
I know, Grandpa, but in a way, I think she is here with us. And I'm grateful that you gave me the chance to know the family I've always wanted, even if in a way different from what we imagined.
Mr. Wilkes, with tears in his eyes, looked at Hannah, his heart full of gratitude.
Thank you for giving me a second chance to be your grandfather, Charlotte. You've given me more than I could have ever dreamed.
And I thank you for helping me find my way back to you.
Hannah replied, her voice filled with emotion. They embraced, and in that moment, the pain of the past seemed finally buried along with the old gravestone. A few weeks later, Hannah's 19th birthday arrived, marking not only another year of life, but the beginning of a new phase. The celebration was simple but full of meaning. The mansion, now alive with energy, was decorated with flowers and soft lights, reflecting the new spirit that filled the place. After an intimate dinner with close friends and family, Mr. Wilkes called Hannah to a corner of the room. He held a small box wrapped with a delicate bow, and his face radiated a mixture of anticipation and affection.
I wanted to give you something special, something that symbolizes our journey up to this point,
he said, handing the box to Hannah. She opened the gift carefully, and as she lifted the lid, she found a new blue hair ribbon, almost identical to the one she had always cherished. The ribbon, soft and shiny, seemed to capture the spirit of the past and the present, uniting them in a bond that represented the unbreakable connection between grandfather and granddaughter.
I thought a new ribbon would be appropriate,
Mr. Wilkes said, smiling as he watched Hannah's reaction.
not just for what it represents from our past, but for what it means for the future. We are starting a new chapter, and I want this ribbon to be a symbol of our continuity, of our renewed love.
Hannah, with tears in her eyes, held the ribbon against her chest before hugging her grandfather tightly.
Thank you, Grandpa. This means more to me than you can imagine. I finally feel at peace, at home.
The gift, though simple, represented much more than an accessory. It was the materialization of a reclaimed love, a symbol that, despite all the hardships, they had found their way back to each other. Later that night, when the guests had left and silence reigned in the mansion once again, Mr. Wilkes and Hannah decided to take one last stroll through the gardens. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees, filling the air with the scent of freshly planted flowers. They walked side by side, unhurried, savoring the serenity of the moment. The garden, now full of flowers and life, was a perfect reflection of the transformation they had both undergone. Flowers that once wilted were now blooming, just like the relationship between them.
You know, Hannah,
Mr. Wilkes began, breaking the silence.
I used to walk around here alone, trying to find some kind of peace, but nothing ever compared to this, to walking with you.
Hannah smiled, holding her grandfather's arm.
I've never felt so happy either, and thinking about everything we've been through, I believe that only made our bond stronger.
They continued walking, talking about the future. Mr. Wilkes asked Hannah about her plans, and she spoke of her desire to continue her studies, perhaps pursuing a career that would allow her to help other children in situations like hers. He supported her enthusiastically, promising to be by her side every step of the way.
No matter what you choose to do, I will always be here for you,
he said with a certainty that comforted Hannah's heart. The walk, which once symbolized loneliness for Mr. Wilkes, now represented a new journey, one he would no longer face alone. At the end of the stroll, they stopped in front of the mansion, looking at the structure that had for so long been a symbol of pain, but which now, thanks to love and reconciliation, had become a place of hope and renewal.
We did it, Grandpa,
Hannah said with a smile that lit up her face.
Yes, we did.
Mr. Wilkes replied, squeezing her hand affectionately.
And I'm looking forward to what comes next.
And with that, they entered the mansion together, ready to face the future not as two lost souls trying to find each other, but as a united family, full of love, faith, and the certainty that the best was yet to come. At the end of this emotional journey, Hannah discovers that the truth can be painful, but also liberating. Reconnecting with her past not only brought answers, but also the chance to rebuild family bonds and heal old wounds. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, love and forgiveness can guide us back to what truly matters. Have you ever wondered how your past could impact your present and future? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to click the end card to watch the recommended video. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and see you in the next video.